Hi, I am LuckyLadybug, and I randomly decided to make this video talking about one of my most recent stories. And if you follow my stories at all, you've probably seen the mammoth I just got done posting a few weeks ago. Whether you read it or not, you probably saw I was posting Say Goodbye to the Pain of the Past. It's one of the strangest crossovers I've written, bringing together Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, and Disney's Frozen. Whether you've been reading it or not, you may be wondering how and why such a strange thing happened. Or maybe you're not wondering at all, in which case you probably won't give a hang about this video. Maybe I'll be talking to myself with it, but I've decided to try making it anyway, because I had a lot of things I wanted to say about it, and I just wanted to get that out. And you may also wonder why I've been making these videos with a doll of Hans in the background. Actually, the first time that happened, it was an accident. Didn't mean to film with him there. And when I realized he was in camera range, I just left him there. I mean, why not? Nothing wrong with it. So, obviously I like the guy. I don't go buying dolls of just any character. I have to like him enough to want the doll. Apparently, he has quite a few fans, judging from the wealth of nice fan art I found of him by looking around DeviantArt. The problem is the creators deliberately set out to make Hans likable through most of the film. They admitted this. They didn't want there to be any hint that he was bad, and they did too good a job. I fell in love with the Hans I thought was real, and could never quite accept that he was bad. I also figured that since he was such a creep, I would just have to hide my feelings away and pretend they didn't exist, which is what I've done since 2019 when I first saw Frozen. Yes, I was late to the party, but never mind that. Then Disney decided to release Frozen characters in their racing game Speedstorm. The idea of Hans as a race car driver for some reason struck me as so absolutely perfect I can't even. Not to mention that anyone who knows me knows I absolutely can't get enough of supposed period piece characters existing in the present day. My longing to write Frozen stories set in the present day could actually be a canonical reality without using time travel. That is just one of the most exciting things for me. And on the heels of that, I decided to rewatch Frozen, and finally determined to embrace my feelings about liking Hans instead of just hiding them away. There's a rather amusing and interesting fan theory that the trolls did something to Hans, altering his memories or some such, to make him go bad. They use evidence, such as the trolls actually singing about getting Hans out of the way in their song Fixer Upper. Now, I honestly don't think they would actually do anything to him, but I have to admit the line is pretty what the heck, and I've always thought so. As far as they knew, Hans was a nice guy. He was just in the way of Kristoff, so they wanted him booted out. I finally decided to explore my version of the idea and wrote an unpublished chapter for a story where two young trolls tried to make Hans fall out of love with Anna, but because they were untrained, the spell went wrong and got out of control. To me, having just a couple of trolls do the spell makes infinitely more sense than the whole colony being in on it. The story, however, remains unpublished and unfinished, and I'm not sure I will ever continue it or put it up, as right after that the Speedstorm dreams started. Now, sometimes I've been able to turn my dreams into stories or elements of stories, which always pleases me. If you've read some of my Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic stories, Evangeline Lecter's mansion is based on many haunted house dreams I've had, as just one example. Every weird thing happening in her house first happened in one of my many dreams. All of the rooms and the various levels and everything wrong with them was all because of my dreams. So my mind is very messed up. So these Speedstorm dreams were very interesting. They came several sleep sessions in a row, which is unusual for me. I hardly ever have continuing storyline dreams. Apparently, there was a story here that desperately wanted to get out. The basic plot seemed to involve someone trying to kill Hans. There were curious details like him staying in hotel room number 9. Normally, I don't bother giving such mundane details in stories, but since the dream was detailed enough to give a room number, I kept that detail and said goodbye to the pain of the past. Someone then tried to blow up the hotel room. There was also a scene where Hans tried to protect Anna during a snowmobile race and ended up pitching off a cliff. So intense. I believe the Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's characters, Scotch and Radley, also featured in at least one of the dreams. So finally, I knew that with such insistence from my mind, I must write the story that wanted to come out. It was always going to be a crossover with 5Ds. It opens with Scotch discovering Hans is a racer and wanting to talk to him, ecstatic at the thought of Frozen being real. Radley and Callan are skeptical, but after all the weird stuff they've found is real, they can't really tell Scotch there's no way it could be true. They go to New Domino City, where Hans is staying before the latest race, and Scotch tries to talk to him at the hotel. Hans is not receptive. He denies he's the frozen Hans, but because of the delay in getting to his room, he's not there when it gets blown up. Radley and the others witness the explosion and Hans being blasted back by it. He finally admits to them that someone is trying to kill him, and yes, he really is the frozen Hans. As they talk, one of the most important elements of the story comes out. Hans tries to contact his manager, and Radley happens to see the guy's name is Lawton. The last name isn't one he knows, but he's suspicious that it could be the Lawton they know, especially after Hans describes him. Honestly, I swear Lawton was not originally going to be in this story. But when I was pondering a name for the manager, it suddenly struck me that it would be fun if it was Lawton. He hadn't been seen in the stories for a long time, like a year and a half. I'd already decided he was intelligent enough that he likely wouldn't be trying to harm Radley and the others again, but would just try to rebuild his life. And for some reason, managing a racer just seemed like something that wouldn't be out of the range of possibility that he might do, so Lawton became Hans' manager. Was it a mistake to include Lawton in the story? I honestly don't know. It certainly took the story in a different direction than I originally planned, because, spoiler alert, I ended up giving Lawton a redemption arc in this timeline. Now, honestly, I love Lawton as a villain, but detest him as a person. He seems to make me even angrier than ever when I look back on his canon scenes after writing this story. Despite my love of redemption arcs, people know I'm absolutely notorious for writing redemption arcs, but I never intended to redeem Lawton. I didn't feel he deserved that much of my attention, or that redemption was believable for him. He did absolutely horrible things, and didn't have any kind of motivation that made him anything sympathetic. He was just a sadistic, selfish bully. And yet, I feel like the story is well written and poignant and powerful, and somehow made a redemption make sense under these circumstances. Lawton is tired by this point. He's been on the run for like a year and a half. Like Coley Rodman in my Wild Wild West stories. It's not so much that either of them want to be good right now, but they're sick of being on the run and worrying about the police catching them and dragging them off to prison. Coley actually has more to worry about, as people mistakenly think he's done worse than he actually did, and being caught very likely means death for him. Now, even with all that Lawton's done, in the modern era, he wouldn't be facing execution. Coley does end up actually wanting to be good during the course of his arc. And as for Lawton, he's come to care about Hans, and that makes him think more about Malcolm and regret how he treated him. This is something he keeps to himself at first, and it enables the voodoo priest Dr. Raven to prey on his vulnerability and curse him into being a slave for him. Dr. Raven is a character I developed some years ago for my Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic story obsession in New Orleans. He's a little bit of Disney's Dr. Facilier and a lot of Dr. Dove from the Hardy Boys' Nancy Drew Mysteries, the 1970s series. In my story, he's very sadistic and calculating and preys on the good guys all throughout the story, pushing their buttons and exploiting their weaknesses. He returns in a later story, but I'm really ashamed at how I used him in that. He pretty much shows up to be all, revenge. He isn't even the big bad, and he's disposed of off-screen by Yami Bakura. He deserved better than that, and my bringing him into this weird crossover is my way of doing better by him. He's characterized more like obsession in New Orleans and is an actual formidable threat. So, why is a voodoo priest of all people trying to kill Hans? Long story short, Hans inadvertently has a magic item Raven wants, and its magic properties mean that Raven can't get it from him unless he dies. Raven is after magic objects in both this story and Obsession in New Orleans. He wants the power they'll give to him. And he's pretty dang powerful without those objects. It's just he falls short of ruling the world, which is his ultimate goal. Not very original, but at least he's dangerous on the road to perdition. An element I was nervous about writing was Hans interacting with Anna. I wasn't sure it would come off right, but somehow it did, and their scenes ended up flowing. And since I'd decided to take the path of Hans not having turned against Anna of his own free will, I wound up with one of my most hated things to write about, a love triangle in which all the members are good people. I hate that because it's so hard to decide how it should end up. I left it up in the air by the end, but did hint that Anna would probably still choose Kristoff. I'm actually not really a Hans-Elsa shipper like a lot of people seem to be, but hypothetically, if things ended up with Anna and Kristoff, I might entertain the idea of Hans-Elsa. On the other hand, if I ended up with Anna and Hans, part of me wondered what Elsa Kristoff would be like. But since I'm not much of a romantic writer, we probably won't be finding that one out. I was also nervous to write for all the Frozen characters in general. With my chosen characterization for Hans, I pretty much had to construct what he would be like from scratch, based around the thought that he really was genuine in the film up until he was mind-controlled. Hence, in the story, Hans is cynical, wary, and serious after his life was turned upside down by the mysterious and still unexplained mind control that made him turn against Elsa and try to kill her and yeah, you know what I mean. Anna and Elsa. And I also occasionally interjected him making a humorous flub, like saying snowing for showing. This was based on things like him making flubs in the movie, such as in his first scene when he and Anna tumble into the boat. I worried if I would write Elsa and her interaction with Anna okay, but after a brief rocky start, I got the hang of that and I loved it. Of course I would. Olaf I pictured with the excitement and innocence of an Eevee, and that usually made him easy to handle. Kristoff remained a puzzle to me throughout the fic, but I think I handled him all right too. He's protective of Anna, but not overprotective, and he recognizes Hans may become his rival once he and the others come to believe that what Hans is claiming about the mind control is true. And he's not thrilled, but he won't give up on winning Anna's heart himself. My story got very, very trippy when I decided to have Lawton hurt comfort scenes. I love hurt comfort, but Lawton hurt comfort? Really? I actually really like how he first appears on screen in this story, outside of the flashbacks. He suddenly appears in Hans' hotel doorway and collapses, knifed on his floor. Had I already planned to do what I did later, I might not have done that scene, because both things together is probably overkill, but as the story progressed and it became clear that Lawton was Dr. Raven's unwilling mind slave, a strange idea began developing in my mind. I wanted Lawton to somehow sacrifice himself to save Malcolm, Radley, and perhaps others, including Callan. I felt Lawton would thoroughly object to being Raven's mind slave, and he would fight it at every turn. And if he just couldn't shake it off, well, he might do something drastic. I mean, this is Lawton we're talking about. A guy who endangered himself in an explosion in canon in order to try to kill his enemies. He claims he doesn't like taking risks, but what could be riskier than that? This guy doesn't have all his marbles, seriously. The scenario went through many, many revisions before I ended up with the final cut. Lawton had kidnapped Malcolm, Radley, and Callan while under Raven's control, and he decides to bring the old warehouse down on their heads. Somehow, during their ensuing desperation to escape, Lawton breaks free enough to back off and let them try to get out. Then he stays behind as the building collapses on him, feeling that he is a liability and must do this to keep Raven from using him any further. He laughingly tells Malcolm he can't be killed, and perhaps he actually believes that. Then the building caves in. Now, the The aftermath also went through many revisions. Should Lawton be found alive but unconscious? Should he be dead? Should he not be found at all? You know, like, so then they're all up in the air. They don't know if he died or not. Now, I wrote a version with him missing, as an earlier draft with him found dead didn't sit right with me. I'm not sure why. I just didn't feel comfortable with it. But after I revised the sacrifice scene to its final state, where it seemed more powerful, I decided him being missing wasn't good enough, and I wrote a second version of him being found dead. And that time it felt right, so I kept that. But let me be clear, Lawton was always going to come back. Now, if not in this story, in a sequel. Originally, actually, the story should have ended with the aftermath of the cave-in, but I realized it couldn't end there. There'd be too many loose ends surrounding Hans' part of the mystery, and an ending already would be too abrupt and not make sense. So, even though I didn't already plan for the remainder of the story, I continued it for several more chapters. Yeah, I know I should write a detailed outline and blah, 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 but I did actually have an outline up to that original point, and it was only once I wrote up to that point that I realized I really couldn't end it there. In the outline, it looked like it was okay to end it there, but in actual practice, that wasn't okay, so had to continue it, and thus I had to address what to do with Lawton sooner than planned. Now, had the story ended where it was originally supposed to, Lawton very well might not have returned that soon. But as the story developed further, it became clear that he had to return that night. The bad guys could reanimate his body as the undead if he didn't. So he was healed enough to live, and even to stumble around badly wounded for a while, but he needed medical help. So he goes through this big thing. He's seen by Scotch, and then they're able to find him and get help for him. And maybe it seemed like it all happened too fast, but the way that the plot was unfolding, I honestly couldn't see another way to work it. All the different elements of the plot, the bad guys, what they wanted, and I just didn't see any other way except for it to happen the way it did. You know, one of my favorite elements of the story, in fact, what made me want to explore the possibility of redeeming Lawton, was his interaction with Hans, mostly shown through flashbacks in the early chapters. He was gruff and yet protective. And that was something I had never seen from Lawton. We certainly don't see it in canon. It was interesting. And I found myself intrigued in spite of myself. I wanted to see what else I could do with that. And that's what happens a lot of times. I think sometimes people misunderstand. They think I've deliberately set out to redeem characters, and that actually is not the original plan. Like with Babyface Morales in The Monkeys. Absolutely had no intention of any such thing with him. It was only because of how I started developing him and Tony in the stories. And that made me want to see what else I could do with that. And so it was never planned. It just kind of happened. And that's the same with Lawton here. And, you know, I'm still somewhat considering writing a story taking place during the year Lawton and Hans knew each other leading up to the events in this story. I want to see how they first met and some of the early interaction. It just really interested me the way the flashbacks ended up coming out. They were totally unplanned, and I had no idea that it was going to end up interesting me that way, but it did. And after everything is sorted out in the end, the bad guys are caught, and, you know, I'm going to leave some things secret in case you haven't read the story and want to. I want to leave some surprises. So I wrapped it up with, and if you don't want to hear the very end, skip ahead a little bit. I wrapped it up with both Malcolm and Lawton being allowed into a program similar to parole, and Lawton's allowed to stay Hans' manager. So after everything they went through in the story, both of them really seemed like they deserved that kind of an ending at this point. After everything Lawton went through, and Malcolm, I've actually been trying to redeem for a long time. His redemption was planned for like 2 years or more. I've been gradually leading up to that. Lawton's was absolutely not planned. But so they and their former enemies go to lunch as allies, if not friends. It was sweet and satisfying and very feel-good. I highly doubt this is my main timeline, both because of Frozen being real and the timeline mess I'm going to talk about in just a second. And also don't know for sure if I want to have Lawton redeemed in the main timeline, but it was nice writing things turning out like this in at least one timeline. It was just really nice. It felt good. But this is a very convoluted timeline. It ignores Frozen 2. It takes place probably a year or two after Frozen, but for Disney to have made a movie about these real people, the events Frozen was based on would have had to take place farther back than that, you know. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic is usually set in the present day in my stories, and 5Ds is 30 years in the future. Occasionally, I will do a timeline where Classic is in the past and 5Ds is the present day, which is generally what the fans accept as canon. And neither of these timelines would work for Frozen's events only being a year or two old, unless, in this verse, Frozen was released later than 2013. Since the story ended up a three-way crossover, I decided not to even address the Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic characters' ages. With things already such a beautiful mess, I honestly couldn't swear the classic characters were appearing at 5D's ages. So, you know, just enjoy the story for what it is. Don't worry too hard about timelines because you'll never figure it out. I haven't figured it out. I ended up with one very bizarre story that is a timeline unto itself. If you read it, did you like it, hate something I did in it? Well, if you don't like it, you can at least be satisfied it's not likely to ever be referenced again in another story, unless I manage to get a sequel off the ground, and so far I haven't progressed past the 3rd page of that, so I don't know. Maybe we'll never know who actually mind-controlled Hans in my verse. I don't know. I have a plan, but the story just isn't coming together, so who knows, though. Now, as for myself, I'm in a strange position. While I can't swear that giving Lawton a redemption arc was the right thing, I recognize the story's faults, and I recognized them even as I was writing it, but it was just something that had to come out, and I couldn't see any way to get it out any other way than I did. I feel like the story is well written and good, even though it's trippy, and it should be appreciated for what it really is. A 200-page love letter to 3 things I wanted to celebrate: Frozen, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic. So, there you have it. And if you haven't read the story, maybe now you want to read it, or maybe you are running away from it in horror. I will include the link to it in the description below, and if you have any thoughts on the story, go ahead and lay them on me in the comments. And if you want me to do more videos like this talking about some of my stories, then tell me. I might go ahead on my own and do videos talking about like the really old Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic mysteries that everybody loves. It seems like that's the thing I've written that people mostly remember now, and a lot of people seem to prefer those stories to the ones I did more recently that are actually keeping closer to canon, because of course the old stories, I wrote them while canon was still unfolding, so by the time canon finished there was a ton of stuff in those stories that didn't match up with canon, but people still seem to love those the best, even though I later started a new timeline that fit canon better. But, yeah, you know, nostalgia is popular. It's hard to compete with nostalgia, and people really love those really old stories. So either way, if you want me to talk about, like, the really old stories, or the new timeline, or some other stories, like my Ninja Turtle stuff, put it down in the comments. I'll take that into consideration, and I would be happy to try to put my thoughts together in videos about it. So, thank you for watching. I'm Lucky Ladybug, and we will see you next time.